I'm pleased to share with our listeners today key points from my recent briefing to the Security Council in New York and to exchange views on the situation in South Sudan. During my briefing to the Security Council, I highlighted three recent significant developments in the implementation of the revitalized peace agreement. Firstly, South Sudanese leaders have produced a roadmap which extends the transition for 2 years and provides feasible timelines to implement the essential benchmarks of the peace process, which in turn would lead to free, fair and credible elections in December 2024. It's an important development demonstrating consensus among the key signatories on the way forward. Through a South Sudan-owned process, we hope it will serve to recommit the parties to the objectives and goals set out in the peace agreement. The roadmap will enable the United Nations to provide support to the South Sudanese in at least two of the critical processes required before elections can be held. One is the preparation for elections itself, the other is the drafting of a new constitution. This second process will require South Sudanese to deal with the fault lines and divisions which have seen the country break into conflict on 2 occasions in the last decade. Secondly, we have seen the graduation of a significant part of the first batch of the necessary unified forces. We believe this offers the promise that the transitional government can begin creating a truly national South Sudanese armed force. This could serve to mitigate intercommunal violence and protect citizens through an effective and professionalized security sector. As I emphasized to President Kiir and First Vice President Machar at my last meetings with them, respectively, neither the roadmap nor the graduation of the necessary unified forces is an endpoint in South Sudan's journey on the path to democratic transition. It brings new challenges, including the sustainment, accommodation, payment, ranking, and deployment of the forces, which remained a concern for the Security Council. Thirdly, the President and the First Vice President have managed to resolve the parliamentary impasse, which will enable the transitional national legislature to consider important laws and bills that are critical for reforms contemplated by the peace agreement. These are necessary for the establishment of the institutions which the UN can support and will create the conditions for prosperity and democracy. Even with these positive developments, as I shared with the Security Council, intercommunal conflict continues to fuel repeated cycles of violence. These have the potential to erode the gains made towards sustaining peace across South Sudan. Most recently, the fighting between SPLM-IO opposition forces and the Kitgwang and Agwelek factions have displaced thousands of people within Upper Nile to Jonglei, Unity State, and parts of Sudan. Over 14,000 have been displaced and seek refuge now at the Malakal Protection of Civilian Site. UNMISS is working with the state authorities and humanitarian agencies to support sustainable solutions in Malakal. It is urgent to prevent overcrowding, the outbreak of disease, as well as maintain peace within the communities that live within the UN Protection of Civilian Sites. We also condemn the violence in Mayom, Unity State, and in Ruwalbet, and most recently Anet in Warrap, resulting in casualties and the mass displacement of women, children, and the elderly. In recent days, the Twitch-Nok-Dinka conflict has created a new wave of refugees in Abyei, Warrap, and northern Bahr el-Ghazal. Since 23rd of September, about 3,500 vulnerable persons have been displaced to various bomas in Twitch County. UNMISS is trying to create zones of protection in conflict hotspots within our means and capacity. For example, last month, an integrated peace team led by UNMISS visited Ikotos, eastern Equatoria, to meet with community leaders. They began a process of seeking common ground through dialogue following a series of cattle raids and clashes between local communities and some national security forces. We are backing these grassroots level engagements with national level efforts. I can refer here to the South Sudan National Livestock Conference held on the 1st to the 3rd of September in Juba, where the UN is working in partnership with the government for a closer look at the issue of cattle and migration-related violence. I welcome the spirit of inclusive, honest dialogue and problem-solving in which ministers, governors, parliamentarians, and the Vice Presidency, as well as civil society, engaged on this issue that plays a central role on the fabric of South Sudanese society. One issue that the Security Council remains deeply concerned by is the increasing trend of conflict-related sexual violence. This could be effectively addressed if all concerned parties and relevant authorities put a stop to using sexual violence as a weapon, condemn the practice, and ensure accountability for perpetrators. In this and other regards, the mission is strengthening its support to the justice chain in each state by supporting accountability through the delivery of mobile circuit courts and courts-martial, targeted training and mentoring focusing on criminal investigations, and enhanced capacity to address crimes that risk destabilizing the peace. Let me turn to humanitarian issues. I reminded the Security Council that conflict and climate continue to devastate communities and drive humanitarian needs up, particularly after 4 consecutive years of flooding have already impacted hundreds of thousands of people across the country this year. This year, more than 2/3 of South Sudan's population, 8.9 million people, will need humanitarian assistance. But access to people in affected locations remains challenging due to impassable roads, flooded airstrips, and insecurity on the waterways. Let me emphasize that addressing insecurity, especially along the Nile, will improve humanitarian operations and our response, as well as commercial activities and livelihoods. While the mission is redoubling its efforts by engaging national political stakeholders and partners, including non-signatories and civil society, at the regional level, I've engaged with principal actors during my visit to Khartoum on my way to New York to update on developments and to galvanize support for the peace process. I continue to remind partners and stakeholders that the roadmap provides a fresh opportunity to align all our efforts, an opportunity, in our view, that should be utilized wisely and effectively. Let me reaffirm that UNMISS, together with its regional partners, notably the African Union and IGAD, and the international community, will continue to support the parties in fulfilling their obligations to the people of South Sudan. Before I close, I'd like to address the recent media reports of sexual exploitation and abuse by some aid workers at the Malakal Protection of Civilians site. Firstly, we would want to assure South Sudanese that the allegations contained in the media reports will be thoroughly investigated. Even though the article does not implicate UN staff directly, we take no comfort. As long as there is an imbalance in power between aid workers and aid beneficiaries, the UN must itself take note of the consequences of this phenomenon in all areas where we are present. Secondly, we reassure that the UN system has long maintained a zero-tolerance policy for sexual exploitation and abuse. There are good reasons for this approach. Sexual exploitation and abuse by aid workers, whether in the United Nations, implementing partners, or associated personnel, is a betrayal of trust of a vulnerable population that we are all sworn to protect. The harm caused to victims is lasting as is the damage to the aid community seeking to assist South Sudanese beneficiaries. Anyone suspected will be investigated and punished, whoever they are, and without restriction. This has long been the case. But this is not enough. It is critical that the zero tolerance policy is emphasized to staff, whether civilian or uniformed, and for this reason, instruction in the UN Protocol on SEA is obligatory, including the duty to report incidents which come to the knowledge of any staff members. This also is not enough. We have recognized the necessity to drive this policy through an accessible complaints procedure. The UN has established 14 community-based complaint centers to encourage reporting of complaints, as well as 13 prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse task forces to systematize, harmonize, and enforce the approach. The UN has also recognized the importance, or has particularly recognized, the importance of protecting and supporting victims, placing them at the center of our prevention and protection approach. We've established 3 centers to promote a victim-based approach, and additional centers are planned. We have noted the reduction in complaints against UN and UN-related staff, but this too should not be regarded as enough. I have repeatedly inquired from responsible UN officials whether we are doing anything we shouldn't or not doing anything we should to sustain our prevention efforts, regardless of who employs the perpetrator.